computer. So, all right, we are now officially recording, and I'm still pretty new to Zoom. So if I screw something up and I boot us out, I apologize. Does everybody see my PowerPoint presentation on their screen? Cool, excellent. I can't, let me just make sure I got my presentation view. There we go. So once again, this is gonna be very brief, and this just kind of give you an idea. So we're all, when we talk about the topic of climate change, we all are using the same vernacular and the same understanding of the topic and the same understanding of the terms being used when we talk about these things. So let's see. So the big thing first is we're going to talk about the key definitions and understandings. So a lot of times people talk about climate change and global warming interchangeably, and for the most part they kind of are. But the general idea is that climate change is the umbrella term for the shift in worldwide weather phenomena associated with the increase in global average temperature, while global warming is the feedback loop that's informing the temperature change through the warming of the atmosphere, which leads to different other functions. When we say things like anthropogenic, these kind of fancy terms, that basically just means man-made. Greenhouse gas is not just carbon, but is any of the atmospheric gases that contribute to the greenhouse effect. And when we talk about sea level rise, we're talking about the natural and unnatural phenomena in which fresh and ice water accumulation leads to higher levels of water at coastal edges. And then we're also going to be using these two terms a lot, but they're very different. One is adaptation and the other is mitigation. When we talk about adaptation, what we're really talking about is that we recognize the effects of climate change are happening currently, and that we're seeking to counteract the harms that are currently happening and are planning to happen. So adapting to a new climate future. While mitigation is we're trying to cease the introduction of carbon and try to stop the feedback loops that are causing carbon and other greenhouse gases to be entered into the atmosphere. So sometimes you hear people say, how do you plan to adapt? How do you plan to mitigate? Those are two separate terms, and just something that, so just knowing that basically I've given presentations like this before with people who have climate deniers, and it's just good to start the conversation with, this is the definitions I plan on using. So, and then when we talk about anthropogenic sources, a lot of people assume it's just CO2, which is, I don't know if you see my mouse, but the CO2 in the middle there is the main focus of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. They're mainly caused by transportation, industry, and energy consumption. But they also don't hold as much heat as methane, which is the gas on the left where the cow is. And methane, CH4, has the highest heat consumption properties, so it holds more heat than CO2, but we're just putting a lot more CO2 into the atmosphere than we are methane, which is caused by primarily agriculture. And then what people don't know is that water vapor is also a greenhouse gas. When you go down the road and you see the factories with their towers pluming with smoke, well, most people think that is being CO2. Actually, that's water vapor. That's what happens is that there are these feedback loops of the heat being added. It's keeping surface temperatures on the water hot, meaning more vapor is coming off of bodies of water, going back into the clouds and just kind of reinforcing itself as it gets hotter, more water vapor gets added. So those are kind of the three main sources, but there are others that we can talk about. And then you've all kind of seen this in terms of the greenhouse effect, but essentially that we get heat coming into the atmosphere, and many of it gets absorbed by the earth itself in the form of plants and with impermeable surfaces. And a lot actually gets reflected out. Only 2% of the total sunlight that comes into the earth actually stays here. And then what happens is when this red circle here, which signifies the atmosphere, is getting holds in that heat, that's what allows us to have the temperatures that we currently enjoy. And CO2 is just kind of reinforcing and making the heat holding properties of the atmosphere stronger, and therefore we're getting more global temperature increases. So now we're getting to the climate report. I know some of you had said that they didn't read some of it, or they didn't, and you don't generally need to in the context of this, because I'm sure you've read articles that kind of summarize what was happening. But generally, when we talk about climate change in the UN, they talk about what are called temperature targets. And the thing that we have here is they want to keep global temperature rises to get no higher than 1.5 degrees Celsius, which I think is about 3 degrees Fahrenheit on average. And 2 degrees is something they had otherwise, but that also is another pathways. They're called carbon pathways. And if we can keep temperatures below that, they would say, then we would kind of resist some of the effects of climate change. And so the report is saying that we're currently at 1 degree Celsius increase. So we're already 2/3 of the way to the global pathway that is going to give us issues when we start to get to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that's going to reach that point by 2030, which is, 11 years away from now. Also, warming from emissions will persist for centuries to millennia. So this is something that will stay it's not something you can actually reverse. It's something that stays common as it's very tough for carbon to be reintroduced out of the atmosphere. And this graph that you see here is generally saying what is the likely scenarios if we keep low, which is the lower blue lines, versus what happens if we don't do anything, which is the purple lines. You start to see, temperatures going up higher versus much lower if we kept our carbons low, meaning we'll be higher than the 1960, but not as high of a rate. And these are just some statistics, which means that sea level rise will lead to a multi-meter rise based on the ice sheets melting, as well as the Greenland ice sheet melting as well, and adding fresh water into the ocean, which will cause sea level rises. And this will cause issues with biodiversity. It'll also push people off their agricultural land, and it'll also cause an issue with what is known as climate refugees, which are people that are forced off their land because water inclusion has become a part of their lives. And then in the United States, we also talk a lot about the economy. We are on track to lose 10% of our economy by the end of the century. But that is the general gist of what the report was saying. And the policy interventions were generally what we all know is the Paris Climate Agreement. When we talk about climate change, they talk about Paris, and that was the UN agreement of what to do about climate change. On the state level, they also have energy plans. In Massachusetts, it's called the Clean Energy Climate Plan. And then below that, in Boston, which has a high vulnerability to climate change, they have the Green Bay Boston. So there's a multi-tier level, and at the bottom, there's community action. And this is just an idea, just to give you an idea what the projections look like with sea level rise. The pink and the orange is inclusions of seawater onto urban surfaces. So at the current rates, you'll see that a large percentage of Boston and surrounding communities will be inundated by water at high tide, which is something really important to note. And also with the intensity of stormwater, this just kind of shows you what happens in that bodies of water increase condensation. They have higher amount of rain, which stays in the ground because of the amount of sidewalks and concrete that we have. So this leads to something like flooding, which this is Chelsea here, and this is one of the storm surges that happened last year. And it just shows you one of the many instances that will happen as a result of climate change. And then also a big problem is with trapped heat, and especially in urban environments, of heat islands and heat exhaustion, meaning all of the heat from the sun stays on the sidewalk or radiates upward, and you're having a higher prevalence of heat exhaustion and heat stroke, which is potentially fatal. So that, and I'm going to stop sharing that now, but that's generally the gist of what I want you to kind of have as a background information. There's a whole lot more to know about the topic, but it's just something for us to have before we have our discussion, so everybody kind of is on the same page. But where I'd like to go to next is I'm gonna ask Brian and Johnny to talk about the work they've done in the environment, and specifically if they've had their interventions with climate change in their work. And yeah, so you guys have a couple minutes if you want to talk about that.
Brian and I'll we should have played paper X's to see who'd go first. But I'll go first. But this just means we'll get to the good stuff. So with Brian, so I'll go quick. But so I work currently at the Sierra Club, and for the past I've been here for about a little over a year now, and then prior to that, 6.5 years before that, I worked for the League of Conservation Voters, and worked in a variety of roles over the last 7.5, 8 years. A lot of them have actually done with legal and regulatory compliance, so not necessarily looking at climate change in the same way as someone working on it from a policy side would. A lot of my job has been to help the policy folks shape the work that they're doing to make sure it conforms with like existing laws, and when it comes to like electoral advocacy and things of that nature that get that done legally. But I think the perspective, a couple things that I bring, is having been in these called these big green groups, which you know have not, obviously very focused on climate change, mitigating climate change, but there's been some mistakes, some major mistakes that the green groups have made over the years, in particular as it relates to not centering on people and not looking at issues like climate change as things that are affecting people. Or I really appreciated the Adriana Laurent video that Kyle shared. She's talking about not every problem in the world is caused by climate change, but the pre-existing conditions of inequality are often exacerbated by climate change. And I think from an intersectionality perspective that the, some of the major enviros haven't got it right, and there's definitely some checkered history there, and it's been really interesting working in these groups as the groups we ourselves are trying to change and be more mindful of what's sometimes counterproductive in the way we show up. And I think the more the focus is on the local and the more the focus is on people on the ground, the more success there's going to be in addressing this really humongous catastrophe kind of facing the people in in the planet. Like, and I guess the only other note I'd say before I'll kick it over to Brian for his thoughts, I thought about sharing this with Kyle, but figured it was probably a little too irreverent, and I didn't want to if folks aren't into it, like, but I do feel the need to share. I don't know if anybody is a Saturday Night Live fan or like has seen like Weekend Update, like Michael Che and Colin Jost. They're When the climate change report came out, I guess it was that October, they did a 2-3 minute spiel on Weekend Update, and one of the lines I think from Michael Che was like, "Nobody cares about everything. People only care about something." And when you overwhelm folks sometimes with like the dire, like everything is going wrong, and like the truth is that like lots of bad things are happening with climate change, like sometimes that message gets tuned out. But when you connect it to what it means for them, like there's lots of work at Sierra Club right now fighting pipelines and other fossil fuel infrastructure, which in turn fuels climate change, particularly in economically disadvantaged communities or communities that have otherwise been marginalized. So there's a lot of bad things that go along with with climate change, fossil fuel pollution, and like some of the mercury from coal and like gas leaks. We have to recognize that like that's been a problem that's been affecting communities, and communities have been fighting back for years. Maybe they haven't been using climate change as like a frame or the the thing that they're centering on in their advocacy fights, but we're in some instances we've been there in the beginning. In other cases we're a little coming late to the party and trying to be supportive of what others are doing as they're leading in the fights. But there's you connect it to what matters to folks locally, and you show how like, yes, there's a greater risk of hurricanes in Florida. If you're living in Miami, like I appreciate the Boston map, but Miami's already flooding on a lot of non-rainy days. So like I think this I'd be really interested to hear as we get going other folks' perspective on kind of what things that they've come across or how it's impacted them locally or folks that they care about. So I'll shut up there and turn it over to Brian.
There we go. No, Johnny, thank you. That's awesome, and your work is unbelievably important. I don't think there's any such thing as perfect work in any field, but it's important to move in the right direction. So have two businesses here in Colombia, and they're private sector businesses that are focused on doing good things in the public. And that's after spending many years in the public and in the nonprofit sectors. To become fascinating with the private sector has been a big change for me. But is we're building Colombia's very first upscale sustainable retreat. So it's an eco lodge. It's the first one in Colombia ever, and is a big deal for various reasons. One is that we're attracting new types of economies and people to Colombia that have never been coming here before, that have been going to countries like Costa Rica and Ecuador and Peru, and we're taking them to the countryside, which has been very affected in the past by both the violence and as well as economic disadvantages. And then we also have a high-end travel business where we show people the real culture and the real aspects of this country. Now, why is that important? Why does this have anything to do with climate change? A bunch of reasons. One, in terms of just like the construction and the things that we're showing people, especially on the hotel side, we're using materials that are completely sustainable, that are techniques that can be replicated in a lot of places, and show that sustainability can be luxury. So for example, we are using bricks that are made out of compressed earth from our same property, which means that we have not had to use any trucks to ship out dirt. We have not had to bake even one brick. And the materials that we use are naturally bioregulators, which is to say that they control heat and cold. So they absorb heat during the day and they give it off at night. We also use sustainably harvested bamboo, which is native to Colombia. And this is sometimes called nature's iron. It's a material that is incredibly durable. It lasts a really long time. It grows extraordinarily fast, and it eats a lot of carbon. And it's something that's found throughout the country. And is a material that's available in other parts of the world. And so these are things that we are taking to a 5-star level. So we're showing people from other places that they can have luxury using recycled materials, using basic materials that they may have otherwise discarded. And then we are also showing things to local people that are great tools that they can use on their own. So our entire property is based off of permaculture principles, down to the architectural design. I won't go too deep into that, but essentially we're giving farmers other ways to have economic gains, but we're also showing them ways to not have to burn their crops after certain cycles. So a lot of people think, oh, you put things in the ground and they grow. Well, that's not true. The soil, the earth has finite properties, right? So you grow something, and whatever you're growing eats all the minerals, and it eats all the nutrients out of the ground. And so there are finite ways to put those minerals back into the ground. I mean, the most common throughout the world is by burning all of your crops so that the materials that you burn disintegrate and they go back into the soil. But there's other ways to do it. You can plant things that have the effect of putting phosphorus or nitrogen back into the soil, or different trees that naturally drop their leaves in times of drought to actually like auto sustain themselves by feeding themselves. There's different ways to teach people to do these different things. Why Colombia, and why is this important here? And sorry, I know I'm droning on a lot, but this is coming back to climate change, which is that we are essentially the most biodiverse country on the planet. So in terms of flora and fauna, we're number 2 in the world behind Brazil. But in terms of other things, we're number 1 in a wide host. So where we have the most bird species in the world. In Medellin, in the valley where I live, there are more bird species here than in the entire United States. We are number 1 in orchid species. We're number 1 in vertebrates. We're number 1 in different types of fruits that are cultivated from anywhere in the world. We have more regions than any other country in the world. We have more indigenous tribes than any other place in the country, in the world. So although Colombia only covers 1% of the planet, we have about 10% of the world's species here. And we see climate change every single day. I mean, I see temperatures that have changed completely. I was visiting an indigenous community last June, and I saw a river that was completely dry, and it hadn't rained in this region for 6 years. and there were migratory bird species that are no longer migrating. And so when other countries like the United States feel an impact, it's doubled here. So when El Nino hit California in 2014 and caused a lot of flooding, it caused an extraordinary drought here that we're still recovering from. And it affects crops as well. So going back to temperature changes and everything that Kyle was talking about at the beginning, it changes different cycles. So for example, Colombia is famous for its coffee. We grow some of the best coffee in the entire world, which is a whole other topic I could talk about forever. But the thing to understand is that you can't just grow anything in any place around the world. So coffee has to be grown between different elevations and at different soil composites. But with the change in climate in global temperatures, this affects a crop like coffee. Now you can't necessarily grow it as well at 800 meters above sea level. Now you have to move it up to 1,000, which means you change the global market for coffee, because what was considered a high altitude coffee at 2,000 meters before is now at 2,200 meters. And all those properties, people who were growing it down below, now can't grow coffee. And you think, okay, great, well, what does that have to do with anything? Well, you might be changing an entire year of a farmer's income. And when that farmer is only making income twice a year on 2 coffee harvests, and now they get 1 coffee harvest or they get none at all, that's an entire year that they can't feed their family. And so from 2014 to about 2016, that one drought that was based on El Nino, which was directly linked to climate change, completely threw a wrench into the entire economy here, because you had a whole year where the coffee plants didn't produce and nobody had harvest. Then the next year, all these plants had all this built up energy and spewed out a ton of coffee. They ended up having to throw out half the coffee because there wasn't enough people to help process it, because processing coffee isn't just picking the coffee, it's fermenting it, it's depulping it, it's doing a bunch of other things, and then taking it to the global market and hoping that there's enough consumption for it. But then that year, because all those plants had produced so much coffee, meant that there wasn't the traviesa, which is the counter harvest, which meant that you affected a whole nother year of coffee. So for a few years, one global climate event had a major impact on the economy here. In that, a lot of that is controlled by the private sector, and why it's really important to educate people and people who are buying a lot of products. I'm sorry I'm droning on. This is sort of the last thing that I'll leave before turning it over. The vast majority of climate change is affected by 2 countries, by the United States and by China. But it's the rest of the world that feels the effects of that much, much more than those 2 countries, in part because these countries don't have the same resources to buy their way out of different effects, which is why activism in the United States is one of the most important things. And this is the other reason that I'll tie this back to what goes on here. What people say in the United States matters and affects the rest of the world. So the rhetoric that Trump is using in the United States right now is the same exact rhetoric that is being put into place by the new president of Brazil, who is actively, one of his policy platforms before getting elected was cutting down the Amazon, which he's now doing. He's murdering indigenous tribes and justifying it under false language that he borrows from Trump, and he's cutting down the Amazon to have soy crops and to have cow farming. Now, if the amount of Amazon that exists, which is right now at 81%, drops down below 80%, we're in big trouble as a planet. And you double that by the effect that this is all going to 2 of the least ecological types of farming in the world. Essentially, the data that Kyle was showing at the beginning is extraordinarily important, but we've essentially crossed the line of no return. We have passed the indicators and the markers that people have been talking about since the 70s, and we're essentially at the point now where we need to reduce our carbon footprint. So at our hotel, we have reduced people's footprint by about 70 to 80%. But beyond that, we basically need carbon eating technology. And that's, as a planet, what we need is the future. So the easiest technology is trees, right? Trees eat carbon. That's sort of an oversimplification, but we're at the point now where we need technology focused on those types of effects. So sorry, it was a long, rambling introduction. I'll leave it there and turn it back over to Kyle.
No, definitely wasn't really. And it's all important pieces because I want everybody before. So basically, we're going to enter into a more roundtable discussion for us to kind of talk about this topic a little bit more. But it's important to note that there's multiple sides to this one coin that is climate change. And I personally approached the problem back in my, previous to doing this job in parks and green spaces, which has generally been my job prior to working here. But I'm going to start with a question that we'll do this popcorn style. So feel free to answer as you will. But the first question I'm going to have is, knowing what you now know about climate change, whether it be before this activity or during the activity, knowing what you do about climate change, what are some of the suggestions or strategies that you've heard that would be a counteract to the effects of climate change? So what have you experienced were potential solutions that you yourself could do? And this is simple answers if you can. So to lead the question a little bit is, I know I have been asked to, consume less, meat. I've also been asked to buy new light bulbs. I've been asked to use a specific washer and dryer. In fact, I'm going to share my screen again, just so you can see what I mean by the question is. This is the kind of idea that we have when it comes to the suggestions that we currently have of climate change. Why is it not going down? Sorry. Come on. Oh, it's because it's ending. Okay. Sorry, I'm going to hit it through a few times. All right. There we go. So this is something that is a standard package of how to reduce climate change as an action, which is upgrading light bulbs to switching electric cars. And one that's really been big on the right side is having one fewer child. So issues of how many kids I have is something that's been presented to me. So I'm wondering, as the group, are these things that you've also experienced when talking about climate change? And do you see any problems with it?
So this is Tia. I don't know if can you hear me? I'm trying the video on my phone and the phone on my phone. Okay. So I'm right there with you, Kyle, in terms of making some of those lifestyle changes. So I decided to become vegetarian a couple months ago and just be more committed to it, and realized I wasn't buying any meat at home, and honestly, I'm not missing it or missing out all that much when I go out to eat or out with friends. Like, hasn't been a hard transition for me. I think if I was told as a girl from Wisconsin that I was going to be vegan tomorrow, that would be a harder sell. But I think it would be doable. I also think it's interesting to think about, there are certainly diet changes that we can look at to impact or have impacts or make our own footprint smaller. I think it's interesting too to think not just about like, I'm going to switch to non-dairy milk, but even being a little more educated about how much water goes into raising a single almond that then makes your little carton of almond milk. And so getting a little smaller level and thinking specifically about when you are making vegetarian choices, the water that goes into some of those things, and how your produce is grown, where it's grown, the type of farm. I think it's interesting to think about. I'm going to play off of John's comedy bit, but there's like that initial Portlandia episode where they're at a restaurant and they're like, well, we want to go meet the chicken. I'm currently reading a book, and that was one of the recommendations that I asked where this came from, where this apple or this pepper or whatever. And I don't know that I'm ready to make that leap yet. I wish I was. I just don't know if I'm ready to be that person. But I think some of those, just thinking about what's on your table and what you're taking home, I think is a good first step if people are trying to look to get into it.
Any other things that you've interacted with that said, this is how you solve climate change yourself?
Sorry, can I jump in and dominate the conversation again? Tia, that's awesome. Being a vegetarian is one of the biggest ways you can make a change on this. I'm biased on this. I was a vegetarian for 11 years. I stopped for about 6, which had to do with cultural reasons before I went to Peace Corps. And I'm back to being a vegetarian again. And it makes a huge impact. I thought Kyle's graphic was really interesting because a lot of that stuff is going, I'm not to be like anti-US, so that's not at all what I'm trying to do. But a lot of the things that were on that chart are US centric. And most other countries, a lot of those choices are made for you. So for here, if we don't separate all of our trash into organics, inorganics, and recycling, we get fined. And this coming from a South American country, most people in the rest of the country don't have dishwashers. Most countries in Central and South America power most of their electricity via hydroelectric power. And so the rest of the things become smaller changes, vehicle use, eating habits, and it's not easy to make behavioral changes, especially when you've grown up your whole life accustomed to one thing. So, you should congratulate yourself for being a vegetarian. I can give you 1,000 reasons to do so and why humans shouldn't eat meat, but that doesn't make it easy to make that decision. Especially when so much of US culture is based on eating meat. So seriously, huge congratulations on that. It's not easy to do, but thank you for doing that.
What does everybody think about going green in terms of the products that they use? Like buying the green soap, buying the green, or things that are labeled green. Is that something that's also been a strategy that you've used personally? And this is kind of the last thing we'll touch on, but the 2 questions I want to ask is, are those things that you think, do you feel that those ideas are effective? And do you think consumption is the only way that we can address climate change?
Can I be mildly provocative and just throw out a comment that may take things slightly different too? You can define consumption in a lot of different ways, right? And there's personal consumption, but then there's also more societal too. And we have to think about our personal choices. And I don't think I don't know, I guess I would not feel comfortable being an advocate for other people making cuts to their consumption if I wasn't doing it myself. But I think it's not just about us sometimes. It's also about sometimes standing up in solidarity for things that are hurting us in terms of trying to fight against climate change and mitigating against climate change in other communities that are that their voices aren't being heard in the same way. So I think of the a Standing Rock in North Dakota, and that's a dirty fuel pipeline trucking some of the dirtiest, or looking to move some of the dirtiest oil on the planet, like fossil fuel intensive, through sacred land for a Native American community, and threatening their water. So that may not have, I mean, there's definitely a climate change component to that, but there's multiple reasons to fight back on DAPL and the Dakota Access Pipeline, to do the acronym thing, but it's standing in solidarity with folks that don't want consumption forced on them in the way that it is. And so there's all sorts of opportunities to help add your voice to the shouts of others. And that can be and that can matter on the consumption side, even as we're trying to, individually make personal choices um, to really reduce our own carbon footprint. Sometimes it's easier for folks with, I know I come from a place of middle class privilege, so like it's easier for me to make certain financial decisions that are harder for someone that doesn't have the means. And again, we think of equality and equity and fairness, and like the folks that have to deal with the aspects of climate change the most are the folks that usually have the least resources to adjust. I mean, that goes to what Brian was saying in terms of like, United States and China. We have, as broad societies, we can pay our way out of like figuring out a way like to deal with the nuisances. But my entry into service was through the AmeriCorps NCCC program in 2005, and one of the things I ended up doing was working in a Red Cross shelter in Baton Rouge after Hurricane Katrina. And that was the shelter at that point, been a couple weeks after the hurricane, there's still 2,000 people there. And it was not folks with a lot of means. Let's put it that way. It's folks that didn't have anywhere else to go. And no single hurricane is caused by climate change, but climate change causes there to be a whole lot more hurricanes, as we're starting to see here over the last couple of years. And, we look at who's affected. And so I would advocate for us making personal choices, but also thinking about what can we do to speak up and stand up for others who are going to be impacted by climate change, and or especially folks lend our voices or other kinds of support we can give where folks are already fighting on the ground against things that are going to make things worse, like the Dakota Access Pipeline.
Right. And to jump in, and I'm going to open this up to the group because just to give us a time check, we've got about 5 minutes left until 8. I mean, if people don't mind going maybe a minute or two over, we can go into this next topic, which I'll extend to the group, which is, hearing the solutions, hearing the problems in the work that you're currently doing, whether it be in health, community service, or work that you'd like to do for those that are still students. How do you see climate change either being a component of the work you're going to do, and how you would kind of address it through the work that you do moving forward? Because John and Brian have intimated this idea of, climate change exacerbating issues of equity and equality, as well as being issues affecting people who are marginalized the most. So I want people to think about that a little bit, and maybe to those who haven't spoken as much, to give some space for that.
Hey everyone, this is Callie. So I'll jump in and my fellow CNCS people can jump on board with me. But where I see climate change continually interacting with community service is exactly what Johnny just said, which is like that cross-section of disaster response. And something that's encouraging and disheartening is where we're seeing the most bipartisan support for community service a lot of times has to do with disaster response, because it's very visceral. The images are extremely intense. It's affecting so many different communities. There's hurricanes, there's fires, there's floods, there's everything. And then in turn, it's a really easy response to show where AmeriCorps members are immediately responding. They have their vests, they have the A's on the shirts, and we can really show an immediate impact. And what's fascinating is trying to then see, and CNCS doesn't do this per se, but to be able to make that connection for a congressman, for a city or whatever, saying, you just saw what the effects of a disaster are, you saw how this affected your community, almost like how you need to prevent an illness by taking care of yourself first instead of, taking care of yourself once you're sick. Communities need to be prepared for these sort of environmental changes so that this disaster doesn't happen. And that's in my brain a logical step, which is, hey, whoever congressman, you saw this disaster. Wouldn't it be nice if you made your community more sustainable, ecological with your practices so that you could hopefully be better prepared for the next disaster? It doesn't always get that far. But that's somewhere where we are seeing almost like a road of where that conversation can happen, because it's we agree that this is bad, we agree that the effect is bad, so now let's get to a place where we can really do prevention in a meaningful way. And just to kind of echo, and living in DC always, I do try to make personal choices, but I really, not to take the responsibility off myself, but I think just that constant reminder that like in the US, politics, advocacy matters so much for us and the world. Like Brian was saying, what we do here affects everyone. And so a lot of what I've been trying to do is just stay more informed and like add myself to listservs and petitions and, you know, try to be better at emailing Congress and joining those call days as a challenge to me because I don't like doing that. But realizing that have a greater effect than remembering to bring my bag to Whole Foods one time, which I try to do. But really, I think pushing myself on that advocacy thing and trying to figure out ways to have that conversation is where I see both my work and my personal life and in climate change kind of all coming together.
It's definitely a both and thing. So yeah.
Anybody else have any thoughts? And maybe you haven't even thought about it really as part of your work, you know, so I remember people asking, what are, you know, Kyle, you want to work with citizen leadership and stuff like that, but you've done all this climate change work. How do you see it working together? And I do see a lot of connections with the work that I do. My favorite line that I've heard from a paper that I read was, climate change was born in the crucible of inequity. And I think that to me is a really good summarization of the fact that climate change isn't the coal mine, it's the canary, and it's the big, very, very big canary in that regard. So I don't know. And I think that has been something that I've always thought about as well, is, you know, that it's not the end point, it's not this approaching thing, but it's the symptom of this ever-growing inequity. So, but does anybody else have a reflection for themselves for their work, where they hope to go with their jobs, that kind of stuff?
Kyle, can I jump in really quickly? Sure. Because I think this is really important. There's a big distinction in climate change between the personal and the global, right? So not eating meat, taking your bags to the grocery store is something that each of us can do. And those are important things. More people need to do them. The other is effectuating change on a global scale and being sort of an activist. And climate change is a topic that is very, very tough because it's an economic issue. And because it's an economic issue, it means there's winners and there's losers. And so in order to not overly politicize the issue and actually get people on board, we have to accept that. We have to accept that it's an economic issue, and we have to find ways to speak to people who are potentially losing about how they can potentially be better off afterwards, right? So why are hybrid cars so popular in the United States right now? Because everybody started buying them, and because it was an economic alternative that really worked. And that is the beauty of different types of technologies and clean technologies and different things that we can do to enter the market. It's not ideal. Cosmo doesn't like it either. But it's something to keep in mind. I think it's something that like a lot of activists have to start to accept and think about a little bit more.
I'm going to give us about a minute or two before we can close the conversation. But does anybody else have any other thoughts based on the work that they're doing, or just kind of continue that question of what does it, you know, mean for the work that you're doing, or where you'd like to go as a citizen leader, and ways that we can address it? Am I on mute? No, okay. Just want to make sure I wasn't like pantomiming the question to you. Interpretive dance.
Yes.
So, anybody else have any thoughts prior to us going? I know we started a little late, so just want to make sure we're respecting people's time. All right. Well, if that's being said, just so we can respect people's time, it's 8:01. I want to thank everybody for coming out to this conversation, to have open minds and open ears, and really talking about the subject as in the many facets, as Brian and Johnny and I were talking about the multiple facets of what this kind of large scale topic means. And I want to kind of allow this conversation to continue if you'd like. And, you know, if people want to talk with me and Brian and Johnny would like to, you know, extend that to stuff in the work that they're doing, or if you're doing a specific topic on health and you want to find ways in which you can include climate change as part of that work that you do, feel free to reach out to your fellows. I'm trying to find a better way of saying that. or you can always reach out to me as well, because I have my experience as well in the process. So once again, I want to thank everybody for coming in on the conversation. I think it was such a great, fruitful conversation. And I thank you all for allowing me this space to take over one of the convenings, because it's not something I'll be doing from now on, but it's a topic I'm passionate about. So really appreciate it. We have someone on the phone right now. Who's on the phone? Hello?
Hey, it's Damon. My computer died, and I'm like,
I felt we got an unfriended going on here, so.
Yeah, no, sorry.
That's all right. So thank you guys. I appreciate it. And once again, this will be on YouTube soon. I'm going to stop the recording now.